The Gnome, a Fairy Tale by the Brothers Grimm. Once upon a time, there was a rich king who had 3 daughters. They walked daily in the palace garden, and the king was a great lover of all kinds of fine trees. There was one tree, however, for which he had such affection that if anyone gathered an apple from it, he wished them 100 fathoms underground. When harvest time came, the apples on this tree were all as red as blood. The 3 daughters went beneath the tree every day to see if the wind had blown down an apple, but they never found one. The tree was so loaded with apples that it was almost breaking, and the branches hung down to the ground. The king's youngest child had a great desire for an apple. She said to her sisters, "Our father loves us far too much to wish us underground. I believe he would only do that to strangers." As she spoke, the child plucked off quite a large apple and ran to her sisters, saying, "Just taste, my dear little sisters, for never in my life have I tasted anything so delightful." The 2 other sisters also ate some of the apple, and all 3 sank deep down into the earth, where no cock could crow to be heard. When midday came, the king wished to call them to come to dinner. However, they were nowhere to be found. He searched everywhere in the palace and garden, but could not find them. Distressed, he made known to the whole land that whoever brought his daughters back would have one of them as a wife. Upon hearing this, many young men searched throughout the country, for everyone loved the 3 princesses because they were kind to all and fair of face. 3 young huntsmen also went out to search. After traveling for 8 days, they arrived at a great castle with beautiful apartments. In one room, a table was laid with delicate dishes that were still so warm they were smoking. Yet, in the entire castle, no human being was to be seen or heard. They waited there for half a day, and the food remained warm and smoking. Finally, they were so hungry that they sat down and ate. They then agreed to stay and live in the castle, deciding by casting lots who among them would remain in the house while the other 2 sought the king's daughters. They cast lots, and the lot fell on the eldest. The next day, the 2 younger huntsmen went out to seek, leaving the eldest to stay home. At midday, a tiny, tiny man appeared and begged for a piece of bread. The huntsman took the bread he had found there, cut a round off the loaf, and was about to give it to the little man. However, as he handed it over, the man let it fall and asked the huntsman to be so kind as to pick it up and give it to him again. The huntsman was about to pick up the fallen piece of bread when the mannikin took a stick, seized him by the hair, and gave him a good beating. The next day, the second huntsman stayed at home, and he fared no better. When the 2 others returned in the evening, the eldest asked, "Well, how have you managed?" "Oh, very badly," replied the second, and they lamented their misfortune together. They said nothing about it to the youngest brother, for they did not like him at all, and always called him Stupid Hans, because he did not seem to fit in with them. On the 3rd day, the youngest stayed at home. Again, the little mannikin appeared and begged for a piece of bread. When Hans gave it to him, the elf let it fall, just as before, and asked Hans to be so good as to pick it up and give it to him again. Hans responded to the little mannikin, "What? Can't you pick up that piece yourself? If you won't take the trouble to pick up your daily bread, then you don't deserve to have it." The mannikin grew very angry and demanded that Hans pick it up. However, Hans refused and, instead, grabbed the little mannikin and gave him a thorough beating. The mannikin screamed and cried, "Stop, stop, and let me go, and I will tell you where the king's daughters are." When Hans heard this, he ceased the beating. The mannikin then revealed that he was an earth mannikin and that there were more than 1,000 like him. He promised to show Hans where the king's daughters were if he would follow him. The mannikin then led Hans to a deep well, though it contained no water. The elf warned Hans that his companions did not intend to deal honorably with him, so if he wanted to rescue the king's daughters, he would have to do it alone. The 2 other brothers, although eager to find the king's daughters, were not willing to face any trouble or danger. Hans was instructed to take a large basket, sit in it with his hanger and a bell, and be lowered into the well. Below, there were 3 rooms, each containing a princess, guarded by a many-headed dragon whose heads she had to comb and trim. Hans was to cut off the dragon's heads. After imparting this information, the elf vanished. In the evening, the two brothers returned and asked Hans how he had fared. He replied, "Pretty well so far," and explained that he had seen no one except at midday when a little mannequin had come and begged for a piece of bread. Hans told them that he had given some bread to the mannequin, but the little creature had let it fall and asked him to pick it up again. When Hans refused, the elf lost his temper, and Hans gave him a beating, upon which the mannequin revealed the whereabouts of the king's daughters. The two brothers were so enraged by this news that they turned green and yellow with jealousy. The next morning, they went to the well together and drew lots to decide who should first sit in the basket. Again, the lot fell on the eldest, and he was to seat himself in it, taking the bell with him. The eldest huntsman, before descending into the well, said, "If I ring the bell, you must draw me up immediately." He had not gone down far when he rang the bell, and his brothers pulled him up at once. The second huntsman then took his turn, but he too rang the bell shortly after being lowered. Finally, it was the youngest brother's turn. Unlike the others, he let himself be lowered all the way to the bottom. Once he reached the bottom, he stepped out of the basket and drew his hanger. Standing outside the first door, he listened and heard the dragon snoring loudly. Carefully, he opened the door. Inside, one of the princesses was sitting with 9 dragon heads resting on her lap as she combed them. With a swift stroke of his hanger, the youngest huntsman cut off all 9 heads. The princess leaped up, threw her arms around his neck, kissed him repeatedly, and then took her stomacher, made of pure gold, and hung it around his neck. He moved on to the second princess, who was combing the heads of a dragon with 5 heads, and he delivered her too. Then he went to the youngest princess, who was combing a dragon with 4 heads, and freed her as well. All 3 princesses rejoiced, embracing and kissing him without pause. The youngest huntsman then rang the bell loudly so that his brothers above could hear. One by one, he placed the princesses in the basket and had them drawn up. When it came to his turn, he recalled the elf's warning about his brother's ill intentions. Instead of climbing into the basket, he placed a large stone inside it. As the basket was being pulled up, his treacherous brothers cut the rope halfway, causing the stone to crash back down. Believing he was dead, they ran away with the princesses, making them promise to tell their father that they were the ones who had rescued them. They then went to the king, and each demanded a princess in marriage. Meanwhile, the youngest huntsman, left alone, wandered about the 3 chambers in despair, thinking he would have to spend the rest of his days there. As he walked, he noticed a flute hanging on the wall and said, "Why do you hang there? No one can be merry here." He also glanced at the dragon heads and remarked, "You can't help me now either." He paced back and forth so much that he wore the ground smooth. Eventually, he took down the flute and played a few notes. To his surprise, a multitude of elves appeared, and with each note he played, more elves arrived until the room was filled. They all asked what he desired, and he replied that he wished to return above ground to daylight. The elves grabbed him by every hair on his head and flew with him back to the surface. Once above ground, the youngest huntsman headed straight to the king's palace, where the wedding of one princess was about to be celebrated. He entered the room where the king and his 3 daughters were gathered. Upon seeing him, the princesses fainted. The king, enraged, ordered that the huntsman be thrown into prison, assuming he had harmed his daughters. When the princesses regained consciousness, they pleaded with the king to release him. The king, curious, asked why, but they would only say they could not tell him. The king instructed them to speak to the stove instead. He then secretly listened at the door and heard the entire story. Realizing the truth, the king ordered that the 2 older brothers be hanged on the gallows. He gave his youngest daughter to the youngest huntsman as a bride. At the wedding, I wore a pair of glass shoes, and when I struck them against a stone, they made a clink sound and shattered. The King of the Golden Mountain, a fairy tale by the Brothers Grimm. Once upon a time, there was a merchant who had 2 young children, a boy and a girl, neither of whom could yet walk. 2 richly laden ships carrying all his wealth set sail, and as he anticipated great profit from their voyage, he received devastating news that both ships had sunk. Instead of being a wealthy man, he was now impoverished, with nothing left but a single field outside the town. Seeking to distract himself from his misfortune, he walked out to this field. As he paced back and forth, a little black mannequin suddenly appeared beside him and inquired why he was so sad and what troubled him so deeply. The merchant replied, "If you could help me, I would gladly tell you." The black dwarf responded, "Who knows? Perhaps I can help you." The merchant then explained that all his possessions had been lost at sea, leaving him with only this field. The dwarf said, "Do not worry. If you promise to give me the first thing that touches your leg when you return home, and bring it here in 12 years' time, you shall have as much money as you wish." Thinking that the only possibility was his dog, the merchant agreed, forgetting about his little boy. He then wrote and sealed a promise and went home. Upon his return, his little boy, in his excitement, held on to a bench, tottered towards him, and grabbed his legs. The father was struck with horror as he realized the true implications of his promise. However, still finding no money in his chests, he hoped the dwarf had been jesting. A month later, while searching the garret for old tin to sell, he discovered a great heap of money. Joyfully, he resumed his business, became even wealthier than before, and felt that the world was just after all. As the years passed, the boy grew tall, sharp, and clever. With the 12th year approaching, the merchant's anxiety visibly deepened. One day, his son noticed his distress and asked what troubled him. The father, reluctant at first, eventually confessed that he had unknowingly promised him to a black dwarf in exchange for great wealth and had sealed this promise. Now, as 12 years had almost passed, he feared he would have to surrender his son. The son reassured him, saying, "Oh, father, do not worry. All will be well. The black man has no power over me." When the fateful day arrived, the son had himself blessed by the priest. Together, father and son went to the field, where the son drew a circle and positioned himself and his father within it. The black dwarf appeared and addressed the old man, saying, "Have you brought with you what you promised me?" The old man remained silent. His son, however, asked, "What do you want here?" The black dwarf replied, "I need to speak with your father, not with you." The son then said, "You have deceived and misled my father. Return the written agreement." The black dwarf responded, "No, I will not relinquish my rights." They continued to discuss the matter for a long time. Finally, they agreed that since the son did not belong to the dwarf nor to his father, he should place himself in a small boat on a stream flowing away from them. The father would push the boat off with his foot, leaving the son to be carried away by the water. Taking leave of his father, the son seated himself in the little boat. With a heavy heart, the father pushed it off. The boat capsized, flipping over so that the keel was uppermost, leading the father to believe his son was lost. He returned home in mourning. Despite appearances, the boat did not sink. It floated calmly away, with the boy safe inside. After drifting for a long time, the boat eventually reached an unfamiliar shore. The boy disembarked and saw a magnificent castle before him, prompting him to set out towards it. Upon entering the castle, he found it bewitched. He explored every room, each empty, until he reached the last one, where he discovered a snake coiled in a ring. The snake was, in fact, an enchanted maiden who rejoiced at his arrival. She exclaimed, "Have you come, O my deliverer? I have awaited you for 12 years. This kingdom is under a spell, and you must set it free." He inquired, "How can I do that?" The maiden explained, "Tonight, 12 black men, covered in chains, will come and ask why you are here. You must remain silent and let them do as they will. They will torment, beat, and stab you. Endure everything without speaking a word. At midnight, their power will end, and they must leave. The second night, another 12 will come. On the third night, 24 will arrive and cut off your head. However, at the stroke of midnight, their power will be over. If you have endured all without uttering a single word, I shall be freed. I will come to you with a bottle of the water of life, rub it on you, and you will be restored to life and health." The young man responded, "I will gladly set you free." Everything unfolded just as she had described. The black men could not force him to speak a single word. On the third night, the snake transformed into a beautiful princess. She came to him with the water of life and restored him. With great joy, she threw herself into his arms and kissed him, bringing happiness and celebration to the entire castle. Following this, Their marriage was celebrated, and he became the king of the Golden Mountain. They lived very happily together, and the queen bore a fine boy. After 8 years had passed, the king began to think of his father. Moved by a sense of duty and longing, he wished to visit him. Although the queen did not want him to leave, fearing it would bring her sorrow, she eventually relented after he insisted persistently. Before his departure, she gave him a wishing ring and said, "Take this ring and wear it on your finger. It will transport you instantly to any place you desire, but you must promise not to use it to bring me or our child to your father's place." He promised, put on the ring, and wished himself to his father's town. In an instant, he found himself just outside the town. However, when he tried to enter, the sentries refused him entry because of his unusual yet magnificent attire. Seeking a way in, he climbed a hill where a shepherd was tending sheep, swapped clothes with him, donned the shepherd's coat, and successfully entered the town without any issues. When he reached his father's house, he revealed his identity. Despite this, his father did not believe him, claiming his son had died long ago. Nevertheless, seeing the poor shepherd, he offered him something to eat. To prove his identity, the shepherd asked his parents if they remembered any distinct mark on his body. His mother recalled, "Our son had a raspberry mark under his right arm." When he showed them the mark, they finally believed he was their long-lost son. He then shared that he was now the king of the Golden Mountain, married to a king's daughter, and father to a 7-year-old son. Skeptical, his father remarked, "It's hard to believe that a king would wander about in such ragged clothing." Angered by his father's disbelief, he forgot his promise and turned the ring, wishing for his wife and child to join him. They appeared instantly. The queen, however, wept and reproached him for breaking his word and bringing misfortune upon her. He tried to console her, explaining that he acted without malice or intention to harm. Although she appeared to accept his explanation, she secretly harbored ill intentions. Leading her out of the town to the field, he showed her the stream where he had previously set off in the little boat. Feeling weary, he said, "I am tired. Sit down, and I will rest my head on your lap." He then laid his head on her lap and fell asleep. Seizing the opportunity, she carefully slipped the ring off his finger, gently moved away her foot from under him, leaving only the slipper behind, and took their child in her arms. Without hesitation, she wished herself back to her own kingdom. When he awoke, he found himself completely alone. His wife and child were gone, and the ring had vanished from his finger, leaving only the slipper as a token. Returning to your parents is not an option, he thought. They would accuse you of being a wizard. You must set out and walk until you reach your own kingdom. Determined, he continued on his way until he came upon a hill where 3 giants were arguing. They were in dispute over how to divide their late father's property. Spotting him, the giants called out and said that since little men often had sharp minds, he should decide how to divide their inheritance. The inheritance consisted of 3 magical items: a sword with the power to decapitate anyone except the wielder by simply saying, "All heads off but mine," a cloak that rendered the wearer invisible, and a pair of boots that could transport the wearer anywhere in an instant. He requested, "Give me the 3 items so I can inspect them to see if they are still in good condition." They handed him the cloak first. After putting it on, he became invisible and then transformed into a fly. Once he reverted to his normal form, he remarked, "The cloak is indeed effective. Now, let me examine the sword." Initially reluctant, the giants feared he might use it to behead them all and leave only his own head intact. Despite their hesitation, they eventually agreed on the condition that he would only test it against a tree. He did as requested, and the sword cleaved through the tree trunk as effortlessly as if it were slicing through straw. Next, he desired to try on the boots, but the giants protested. They argued, "If you put the boots on and wish yourself to the top of the hill, we will be stranded down here with nothing." "Oh no," he reassured them, "I would not do that." Relieved, the giants handed him the boots as well. Now, equipped with all the magical items, his thoughts turned solely to his wife and child. He uttered to himself, "Oh, if I were but on the Golden Mountain!" And in that instant, he disappeared from the giant's sight, thus resolving their dispute over the inheritance. Upon arriving near his palace, he was greeted by the sound of joyous music, fiddles, and flutes. The people informed him that his wife was celebrating her wedding with another man. Consumed by rage, he exclaimed, "False woman, she betrayed and deserted me while I slept." Donning his cloak of invisibility, he entered the palace unseen. In the grand dining hall, a lavish feast was laid out, with guests merrily eating, drinking, and laughing. His wife, adorned in splendid attire and wearing a crown, sat regally at the head of the table. He positioned himself behind her, unnoticed by anyone. Each time she placed a piece of meat on her plate, he would snatch it away and eat it. When she poured herself a glass of wine, he took it and drank it. She continued to serve herself, but every plate and glass she prepared vanished immediately. Distressed and humiliated, she rose from the table and retreated to her chamber, tears streaming down her face. He followed her silently. In her despair, she lamented, "Has the devil taken control of me, or did my deliverer never arrive?" At this, he struck her face and declared, "Did your deliverer never come? It is he who holds you in his power, you traitor. Is this the gratitude I deserve from you?" Making himself visible, he strode into the hall and proclaimed, "The wedding is over. The true king has returned." The assembled kings, princes, and counselors mocked and jeered at him, but he remained unfazed. "Will you leave, or must I force you?" he demanded. When they tried to seize him and crowded around, he drew his sword and commanded, "All heads off but mine." Instantly, every head fell to the ground, and he stood alone as the master and once more the king of the Golden Mountain. The Raven, a fairy tale by the Brothers Grimm. Once upon a time, there was a queen who had a little daughter still so young that she had to be carried. One day, the child was naughty, and despite the mother's best efforts to calm her, the child refused to be quiet. Growing impatient as ravens flew around the palace, the queen opened a window and exclaimed, "I wish you were a raven and would fly away. Then I could have some rest." No sooner had she spoken these words than the child transformed into a raven and flew from her arms out of the window. The raven flew into a dark forest and remained there for a long time, and the parents heard nothing about their child. One day, a man traveling through this forest heard the raven crying and followed the voice. As he drew nearer, the bird spoke, "I am a king's daughter by birth and am bewitched. However, you can set me free." The man asked, "What must I do?" She replied, "Go further into the forest, and you will find a house where an old woman lives. She will offer you meat and drink, but you must accept nothing. If you eat or drink anything, you will fall asleep and then will not be able to deliver me. In the garden behind the house, there is a large heap of tan, and there you must stand and wait for me. For 3 days, I will come every afternoon at 2 o'clock in a carriage. On the first day, 4 white horses will draw the carriage, then 4 chestnut horses, and lastly 4 black ones. However, if you are not awake but sleeping, I shall not be set free." The man promised to do everything that she asked, but the raven lamented, "Alas, I already know that you will not deliver me. You will accept something from the woman." The man reassured her, promising once more that he would certainly not touch anything either to eat or to drink. When he entered the house, the old woman approached him and said, "Poor man, how faint you are. Come and refresh yourself, eat and drink." He refused, saying, "No, I will not eat or drink." Nonetheless, she persisted and said, "If you will not eat, at least take one drink from the glass. One sip is nothing." Eventually, he let himself be persuaded and drank. Shortly before 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he went into the garden to the heap of tan to wait for the raven. As he stood there, a sudden weariness overcame him, and he lay down for a short time, though he was determined not to fall asleep. However, as soon as he lay down, his eyes closed of their own accord, and he fell into a deep sleep from which nothing could awaken him. At 2 o'clock, the raven arrived in a carriage drawn by 4 white horses. Already in deep grief, she said, "I know he is asleep." When she entered the garden, she found him lying there asleep on the heap of tan. She alighted from the carriage, went to him, shook him, and called out to him, but he did not awaken. The next day, around noon, the old woman returned and brought him food and drink, but he refused to take any of it. She gave him no peace, however, and continued to persuade him until he eventually took another drink from the glass. Towards 2 o'clock, He went into the garden to the heap of tan to wait for the raven. Suddenly, he felt such great weariness that his limbs could no longer support him. Unable to help himself, he was forced to lie down and fell into a heavy sleep. When the raven drove up in a carriage drawn by 4 chestnut horses, she was filled with sorrow and said, "I know he is asleep." She approached him, but he lay there sleeping, impossible to awaken. The following day, the old woman questioned him. "What is the meaning of this? You are neither eating nor drinking anything. Do you wish to die?" He replied, "I am not allowed to eat or drink, and I will not do so." Despite his refusal, she set a dish with food and a glass of wine before him. The enticing smell overwhelmed him, and he could not resist taking a deep draught. When the time came, he went out into the garden to the heap of tan and waited for the king's daughter. However, he became even more weary than the day before and lay down, sleeping as deeply as a stone. At 2 o'clock, the raven arrived with 4 black horses. Everything, including the coachman, was black. She was already in deep grief and said, "I know he is asleep and cannot free me." When she approached him, he lay there fast asleep. She shook him and called to him, but he did not awaken. Then she placed a loaf of bread beside him, followed by a piece of meat and a bottle of wine. He could consume as much as he liked, but they would never diminish. Finally, she took a gold ring from her finger, engraved with her name, and placed it on his finger. Next to him, she placed a letter detailing all she had given him, emphasizing that these items would never diminish, and expressing her certainty that he could free her by coming to the golden castle of Stromberg. Having bestowed these gifts, she seated herself in her carriage and drove off to the golden castle of Stromberg. When the man awoke and realized he had slept, he felt a deep sadness. He thought, "She must have passed by, and I failed to free her." Then he noticed the items beside him and read the letter detailing everything that had occurred. He got up and set out, determined to find the golden castle of Stromberg, though he didn't know its location. After traveling the world for a long time, he entered a dark forest and walked for 14 days without finding his way out. As evening fell once more, he was so exhausted that he lay down in a thicket and fell asleep. The next day, he continued on his way, but in the evening, as he prepared to rest beneath some bushes, he heard loud howling and crying that kept him awake. At candlelight, he saw a faint glimmer and, drawn to it, approached cautiously. Eventually, he reached a small-looking house where a giant stood guard. He thought to himself, "If I enter and the giant sees me, it might cost me my life." After some consideration, he entered. When the giant spotted him, he exclaimed, "It's good you've come. I haven't eaten in ages. I was about to have you for supper." The man replied, "I'd prefer not to be eaten, but if you're hungry, I have enough here to satisfy you." "If that's true," said the giant, "you've nothing to fear. I was only going to eat you because I had nothing else." They sat down to eat, and the man produced bread, wine, and meat that seemed inexhaustible. "This pleases me," said the giant, eating heartily. Then the man asked him, "Can you tell me where the golden castle of Stromberg is?" The giant responded, "Let me check my map. It shows all the towns, villages, and houses." He fetched his map, but couldn't find the castle. "No matter," he said. "I have larger maps upstairs in my cupboard. We'll check those." Yet, they were unable to locate it there either. The man was eager to continue his journey, but the giant asked him to wait until his brother returned with provisions. When the brother arrived, they asked him about the golden castle of Stromberg. He said, "Let me eat my fill first, then I'll consult the map." They went up to his room, searched the map, but found no trace of it. Afterwards, he brought out even older maps, and they persisted until they finally located the golden castle of Stromberg. However, it was many thousand miles away. "How am I to get there?" asked the man. The giant replied, "I have 2 hours' time during which I can carry you into the vicinity, but after that I must return home to nurse the child we have." Thus, the giant transported the man to within about 100 leagues of the castle, and stated, "You can easily walk the rest of the way alone." With that, he turned back, while the man continued onward day and night until he eventually reached the golden castle of Stromberg. Perched atop a glass mountain, the enchanted maiden circled the castle in her carriage before entering it. He was overjoyed to see her and attempted to climb up to her, but each attempt caused him to slip down the glass again. Frustrated at being unable to reach her, he resolved, "I will stay down here below and wait for her." Thus, he constructed a hut and dwelled there for an entire year, observing the king's daughter daily as she drove about above, yet never managing to approach her. One day, from his hut, he observed 3 robbers engaged in a fierce altercation and called out to them, "God be with you." Startled, they paused upon hearing his cry, but seeing no one, they resumed their altercation with even greater intensity. Once more, he called out, "God be with you." Again they stopped, looked around, but finding no one, resumed their brawl. Finally, he shouted a third time, "God be with you," thinking, "I must see what these 3 are up to," and approached them to inquire why they were fighting so vehemently. One of them revealed he had found a stick that opened any door it struck. The second claimed to possess a cloak that rendered him invisible when worn. The third boasted of a horse upon which one could ride anywhere, even up a glass mountain. Uncertain whether to share these treasures or divide them, they deliberated. Then the man proposed, "I will offer you something in exchange for these 3 items. I have no money, but I possess other valuables. First, I must verify your claims." They placed him on the horse, draped the cloak around him, and placed the stick in his hand. With these items, they could no longer see him. He swiftly administered blows to them, declaring, "Now, scoundrels, you have received your due. Are you satisfied?" He then rode up the glass mountain. Arriving at the castle's gate at the summit, he struck it with his stick, causing it to open instantly. Ascending the stairs, he reached the hall where the maiden sat with a golden cup of wine before her. Unseen due to the cloak, he approached her, withdrew the ring she had given him from his finger, and dropped it into the cup, where it emitted a clear ring. Startled, she exclaimed, "That's my ring! The man who will set me free must be here." They searched the entire castle, but did not find him, for he had exited, mounted the horse, and discarded the cloak. As they reached the gate, they spotted him and joyously shouted aloud. He dismounted, embraced the king's daughter, and she kissed him, saying, "Now you have set me free, and tomorrow we shall celebrate our wedding." The Peasant's Wise Daughter, a fairy tale by the Brothers Grimm. Once upon a time, there was a poor peasant who owned no land, only a small house and a daughter. The daughter said, "We should request a piece of land from our lord the king." Upon hearing of their poverty, the king gave them a piece of land, which they dug up and intended to sow with some corn and similar grain. As they were nearly finished digging the field, they unearthed a mortar made of pure gold. "Listen," said the father to his daughter, "since our lord the king has been so gracious in giving us this field, we should give him this mortar in return." The daughter disagreed, saying, "Father, if we take the mortar without the pestle, we'll still need to find the pestle. It's better if you say nothing." Ignoring her advice, he took the mortar to the king, claiming he found it on the cleared land, and asked if the king would accept it as a gift. The king accepted the mortar and asked if they found anything else. "No," replied the peasant. Then the king demanded the pestle. The peasant admitted they didn't find it, but it was too late. He was thrown into prison and told he would stay there until he produced the pestle. Every day, the servants heard him cry out, "Oh, if only I had listened to my daughter! Oh, if only I had listened to my daughter!" He refused to eat or drink. Eventually, the king summoned him and asked why he kept crying out and what his daughter had said. "She told me not to bring the mortar to you, as I would also need to produce the pestle. If you have such a wise daughter, bring her here." So she was brought before the king, who asked if she truly was so wise, and set her a riddle. "Come to me not clothed, not naked, not riding, not walking, not on the road, and not off the road, and if you can do that, I will marry you." She agreed and immediately stripped off all her clothes, then wrapped herself completely in a large fishing net. She sat in it and tied it to the tail of a donkey, forcing it to drag her along. This wasn't riding or walking. The donkey dragged her through the rut so that only her big toe touched the ground, which wasn't on or off the road. When she arrived in this manner, the king declared she had solved the riddle and fulfilled all conditions. He ordered her father released from prison, married her, and entrusted her with all the royal possessions. After some years had passed, The king was assembling his troops for a parade when a group of peasants selling wood halted their wagons in front of the palace. Some had oxen, others horses. Among them was a peasant with 3 horses. One of them had just given birth to a foal, which ran off and nestled between 2 oxen in front of a wagon. As the peasants argued, fought, and caused a commotion, the peasant with the oxen insisted the foal belonged to him, claiming one of the oxen had given birth to it. The other argued it was his horse's foal. The dispute reached the king, who decided the foal should remain where it was found, awarding it to the peasant with the oxen, although it didn't rightfully belong to him. Distraught, the other peasant wept over his lost foal. He had heard of the queen's kindness, knowing she herself came from humble origins, so he sought her help to retrieve his foal. She said, "Yes, I will tell you what to do, if you promise not to betray me. Early tomorrow morning, when the king inspects the guard, position yourself in the middle of the road he must pass through. Take a large fishing net and pretend to fish. Keep fishing and empty the net as if it were full." And she instructed him what to say if questioned by the king. The next day, the peasant stood in the road, pretending to fish on dry land. When the king saw this, he sent a messenger to ask what foolishness he was up to. The peasant replied, "I am fishing." The messenger questioned how he could fish without water. The peasant responded, "As easily as an ox can have a foal." The messenger reported this to the king, who summoned the peasant and demanded to know whose idea this was, as it clearly wasn't his own. The peasant refused to confess, insisting it was his own idea. They then beat and tormented him until he finally admitted he got the idea from the queen. Upon returning home, the king confronted his wife, saying, "Why have you deceived me? I will no longer have you as my wife. Your time is up. Return to your peasant's hut." However, he granted her one request: to take with her the dearest and most precious thing to her. She agreed, embraced, and kissed him, and bid him farewell. Then she had a strong sleeping potion brought, which they drank together. The king drank deeply and soon fell into a deep sleep. She took a fair white linen cloth, wrapped him in it, and had him carried to a carriage waiting at the door. She took him to her little house, laid him in her bed, and he slept for a day and a night without waking. When he finally awoke, he looked around and exclaimed, "Good God, where am I?" He called for his attendants, but none were there. Finally, his wife came to his bedside and said, "My dear lord and king, you told me I could bring with me from the palace what was dearest and most precious to me. I have nothing more precious and dear than you, so I have brought you with me." Tears welled in the king's eyes, and he said, "Dear wife, you shall be mine, and I will be yours." He took her back to the royal palace, remarried her, and they likely live happily together to this day. Old Hildebrand, a fairy tale by the brothers Grimm. Once upon a time, there lived a peasant and his wife. The parson of the village admired the wife and had long desired to spend a whole day happily with her. The peasant woman was also willing. One day he said to her, "Listen, my dear friend, I have now thought of a way by which we can spend a whole day happily together. I'll tell you what. On Wednesday, you must take to your bed and tell your husband you are ill. If you only complain and act as if you are ill properly, and continue to do so until Sunday when I have to preach, I will then say in my sermon that whoever has at home a sick child, a sick husband, a sick wife, a sick father, a sick mother, a sick brother, or whoever else it may be, and makes a pilgrimage to the Göckerli Hill in Italy, where you can get a peck of laurel leaves for a kreutzer, the sick child, the sick husband, the sick wife, the sick father, the sick mother, the sick sister, or whoever else it may be, will be restored to health immediately." "I will manage it," said the woman promptly. Therefore, on Wednesday, the peasant woman took to her bed, complained and lamented as agreed, and her husband did everything he could for her, but nothing helped. When Sunday came, the woman said, "I feel as ill as if I were going to die immediately, but there is one thing I should like to do before my end. I should like to hear the parson's sermon that he is going to preach today." On hearing this, the peasant said, "Ah, my dear, do not do it. You might make yourself worse if you were to get up. Look, I will go to the sermon, pay close attention, and will tell you everything the parson says." "Very well," said the woman. "Go then, pay close attention, and repeat to me all that you hear." So the peasant went to the sermon, and the parson began to preach. He said that if anyone had at home a sick child, a sick husband, a sick wife, a sick father, a sick mother, a sick sister, a sick brother, or anyone else, and would make a pilgrimage to the Guckerli Hill in Italy, where a peck of laurel leaves costs a kreuzer, the sick child, the sick husband, the sick wife, the sick father, the sick mother, the sick sister, the sick brother, or anyone else would be restored to health immediately. He also mentioned that whoever wished to undertake the journey should come to him after the service was over, and he would provide them with the sack for the laurel leaves and the kreuzer. No one was more delighted than the peasant. After the service was over, he immediately went to the parson, who gave him the sack for the laurel leaves and the kreuzer. Upon returning home, right at the door, he exclaimed, "Hooray, dear wife! Now it is almost as if you were well." Today, the parson preached that whoever had at home a sick child, a sick husband, a sick wife, a sick father, a sick mother, a sick sister, a sick brother, or whoever it might be, and would make a pilgrimage to the Guckerli Hill in Italy, where a peck of laurel leaves costs a kreuzer. The sick child, the sick husband, the sick wife, the sick father, the sick mother, the sick sister, the sick brother, or whoever else it was, would be cured immediately. And now I have already obtained the sack and the kreuzer from the parson, and will immediately start my journey so that you may recover faster. And with that, he left. Hardly had he gone, however, when the woman got up, and the parson arrived immediately. However, let's leave these two aside for now and follow the peasant, who walked briskly without pause to reach the Guckerli Hill sooner. On his way, he encountered his friend, an egg merchant, returning from the market where he had sold his eggs. "May blessings be upon you," greeted the merchant. "Where are you hurrying off to?" "To eternity, my friend," replied the peasant. "My wife is sick, and today I heard the parson's sermon. He preached that if anyone at home has a sick child, a sick husband, a sick wife, a sick father, a sick mother, a sick sister, brother, or anyone else, and they make a pilgrimage to the Guckerli Hill in Italy, where a peck of laurel leaves costs a kreuzer, the sick person would be instantly cured. So I have received the sack for the laurel leaves and the kreuzer from the parson, and now I am starting my pilgrimage." "But listen, friend," said the egg merchant to the peasant, "are you really naive enough to believe such a thing? Don't you understand what's going on? The parson wants to spend a whole day alone with your wife in peace, so he gave you this task to get you out of the way." "Goodness!" exclaimed the peasant. "I wonder if that's true." "Come," said the merchant, "I'll tell you what to do. Get into my egg basket, and I'll carry you home. Then you can see for yourself." So they agreed, and the merchant placed the peasant in his egg basket and carried him home. When they arrived at the house, what a lively scene greeted them. The woman had already slaughtered nearly all the animals in the yard and made pancakes, and the parson was there with his fiddle. The merchant knocked on the door, and the woman asked who was there. "It's me, your friend," said the egg merchant. "Please give me shelter tonight. I didn't sell my eggs at the market, so now I have to carry them back home, and they're so heavy that I won't manage in the dark." "Well, my friend," sighed the woman, "you've come at a very inconvenient time for me. But since you're here, come in and sit on the bench by the stove." She placed the merchant and his basket on the bench by the stove. Meanwhile, the parson and the woman were in high spirits. Finally, the parson said, "Listen, my dear friend, you can sing beautifully. Sing something for me." "Oh," replied the woman, "I can't sing now. I used to sing well in my youth, but those days are over." "Come on," insisted the parson, "just sing a little something." With that, the woman began to sing, "I sent my husband away from me to the Guckerli Hill in Italy." Then the parson sang, "I wish it were a year before he came back. I wouldn't ask him for the laurel leaf sack. Hallelujah." Next, the merchant in the background began to sing, though I must mention the peasant was named Hildebrand. "What are you doing, my dear Hildebrand, there on the bench by the stove so grand?" Hallelujah. Then the peasant sang from inside the basket, "I'll hate singing from this very day, and in this basket no longer will I stay." Hallelujah. He climbed out of the basket and chased the parson out of the house with a beating.